Coming to you live via recording from Appleton, Wisconsin, it's time for your conservative smackdown. In this corner, your pugilistic pundit, the Duke of Diplomacy, the Professor of Patriotism, the Doctor of Domestic Tranquility.
This is Right Makes Might with Dr. Duke.
Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Right Makes Might with Dr. Duke. Today we're going to take the fight to the modern political landscape. The title of our episode today is Trumping Socialism, Creating Wealth, Not Dependence and Debt. Well, there's our celebrity of the day. There's the arguably the most notable, most popular politician in the country, Donald Trump. And you know, the thing about Donald Trump is he is what he's always been. The thing that is so frustrating about the Trump debate is the idea that there's a bunch of rubes in this country that are too stupid to know that Trump isn't a bit of a caricature, a bit of a windbag. But you know what else Donald Trump is? He's the same man he was 30 years ago when it comes to one critical issue. The issue facing America. Do we want a richer America or a poorer America? Our national defense depends on our wealth. Our ability to educate our children depends on our wealth. Our ability to affect change in the world depends on our status and our wealth as a country. Donald Trump is the one candidate for the last 30, 40 years who've been insisting that a rich America, a strong America, a wealthy America is an America that can protect its citizens and ultimately look out for the interests of the whole planet. So we're going to go back. We're going to go back all the way to that fuzzy decade, the 1980s, that decade of greed and the me decade, the decade of Reagan and the decade of some really, really bad music. And let's go back to 1988 and that other relic of the 80s, Oprah Winfrey, when she interviewed Donald Trump. And I want you to hear what Donald Trump said way back in 1988 about a potential run for the presidency.
You've said, though, that if you did run for president, you believe you'd win.
Well, I don't know. I think I'd win. I tell you what, I wouldn't go in to lose. I've never gone in to lose in my life. And if I did decide to do it, I think I'd be inclined, I would say that I would have a hell of a chance of winning, because I think people, I don't know how your audience feels, but I think people are tired of seeing the United States ripped off. And I can't promise you everything, but I can tell you one thing, this country would make one hell of a lot of money from those people that for 25 years have taken advantage. It wouldn't be the way it's been.
And that's really remarkable when you think about it. And ask yourself this question. Has America been more or less ripped off in the last 30 years? When you consider the bloating of the federal government, when you consider the toll that illegal immigration has taken on our pocketbooks, when you consider the expanding welfare state, when you consider all of this rot from Washington, D.C. eating up our wealth, in 1988, we were doing pretty well financially. Now we're up to what, 17, 18 trillion dollars of debt? Having said that, let's get to round one. And as you can see, our theme here is going to be what these politicians had to say, how we can look back to the future. That was an 80s movie, wasn't it, Sparky, Back to the Future? I think that was 1988.
Are you telling me that you built a time machine out of a DeLorean?
Back to the future is where we go, because what these politicians, in this case Trump versus that other alternative candidate, this one on the left, Bernie Sanders. People are a little bit tired of the Jeb Bushes of the world, the establishment candidates on the right, and so Trump has become a viable option, but people are also really, really sick of the Clintons, and Hillary Clinton in particular, and so the left is looking for its quote-unquote alternative candidate. Isn't it interesting that on the right, we turn our attention to somebody outside the political arena, somebody who has not been a politician, as an alternative to establishment status quo? Where on the left, who do they turn to on the left? That old, mummified socialist Bernie Sanders. So, in honor of the 80s, we've got a little 80s video for you. Let it roll, Spark. Ah, doesn't that bring back memories of your 80s game console? And I love the fact that our tech people got the hair so good, from Bernie Sanders' Frankenstein look to Donald Trump flopping, I don't know what you'd call that, comb over? I'm not sure what it is. But in any event, going back to the 80s, we've already talked about how, for Donald Trump, wealth is a key. It's been a key for the last 30 years. A richer America, a more prosperous America is an America that's better for everybody. But then on the left, who do we have as our alternative candidate? We've got Bernie Sanders. And his entire premise is more socialism, more debt. This is the left-wing progressive argument here. We need a more socialist America, a more indebted America, a more taxed, a more regulated America. That's going to fix everything. And if we go back all the way to the 1980s, say what you will about that fade comb-over of Donald Trump. In some ways, it's a little bit preferable, isn't it? I don't know what's going on at the top of and look, I'm one to talk, but at least I knew enough to shave my head before it ever came to this. Listen to what Bernie Sanders said all the way back in a 1989 interview on C-SPAN.
And our view is the government has the right to get involved in any area that makes sense. You don't get involved in areas where it doesn't make sense.
1989, Sparky. Government has the right. Who gave them that right? Government has the right to get involved in any area they think they should get involved in. All right? Let me ask you this. We've seen how America's gone from a relatively rich, prosperous country. 1988, the Berlin Wall had fallen. America was the sole superpower, the richest country in the history of the world. Have we gotten more wealthy under politics' status quo? Now you got Bernie Sanders in 1989, 1 year after the Trump interview, telling us that what we need is a government that's not afraid to get involved in any aspect of our lives if they feel it should be done. Who gets to determine who intervenes and how? And ask yourselves this question out there in TV land. Has government intervened more in the last 30 years? And has that intervention been good? Is it really a good thing that we're using eminent domain to close up shop for people, to confiscate land? Is it really better off that we've nationalized healthcare? Are people better off, or even poor people better off that we've nationalized healthcare? In what way has all of this government interventionism really helped us? And the really frustrating thing and frightening thing about a Bernie Sanders is he hasn't changed. It's government's job to regulate, to intervene, to control, to micromanage any aspect of American life provided it sees fit. I love his caveat at the end. We don't get involved in things that don't belong to us. Well, as recently as 10 years ago, marriage didn't belong to you. As recently as 10 years ago, none of this stuff, healthcare didn't belong to you. Seems to me that once you let a socialist loose with his eraser, he's erasing all constitutional rules, regulations, all constitutional checks and balances in the name of the almighty federal government. But let's go back even further with Bernie Sanders, because, you can go back, you can't really go back that far with Trump, but you can certainly go back to the 1970s with Bernie Sanders as a young socialist, a little socialist light, a little baby socialist percolating in the early 1970s. Bernie Sanders, your left-wing hero of minority rights, wrote a really disturbing article, you can see it there on the screen, written in the Vermont Freeman in 1972, titled poetically, Man and Woman by Bernie Sanders. Can't you picture the socialist with a good warm glass of down-to-earth mead, gazing out the window, right, giving us his reflections on man and woman. I'm not going to read you this article because you can find it online, but the things he says are shocking. Basically, one long, detestable little essay in male dominance and female submission standards, all sorts of self-gratification imagery taking place here, all sorts of really troglodytic worldviews. Now, I know. Whenever a left-winger says stuff like this, the leftist posse rides to his defense. So you're getting all these justifications for what Bernie Sanders said. He was really trying to unmake gender roles by writing all that nonsense. Okay, whatever. Mostly what you hear from the left on this is silence. My point is, Bernie Sanders, that mad little scientist in the attic, has the right to write whatever he wants. He can take any position he wants to take. But if it had been a Republican who said that, if you had something like that, think about the missteps and gaffes, some of the goofy things Donald Trump has said. They've been front and center with us every aspect of this campaign, where the long socialist history of Bernie Sanders has largely been covered up and obscured and protected by a liberal media who's promoting an agenda. But let's look a little bit deeper at Bernie Sanders. This is your leftist hero. This is the great champion of social justice and Marxism. Free market economies be damned, right? Well, Media Research Center reports that socialist Bernie Sanders, who sponsored legislation to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, pays his own interns just $12 an hour. Now that would be what, deflation, Sparky? Right? What is that, by the way? Is that socialism? Right. $15 will pay everybody else, but Bernie's going to pay his own interns $12. At a recent campaign fundraiser, This, in the year 2015, in Tony Martha's Vineyard, where all the hoi polloi go, where the Obamas seem to have set up an alternative White House, Sanders bleated that, quote, money cannot be the god of life, even as he solicited big dollar donations from mega-rich donors. In fact, in order to attend this socialist event, a minimum donation on the part of participants of $37,000 was required. Do the math for me, Spark. How many interns can you pay $12 an hour for $37,000? How many interns could have gone to that for that? Sanders also raked in many hundreds of thousands of dollars from extortionist labor unions and, wait for it, the very super PACs he condemns as the bane of the American political landscape. Radical progressive labor unions, thug labor unions, and left-wing super PACs, giving him hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars. The socialist obviously does not have much of a problem with big money, big special interest. According to the site Money Nation, Sanders' net worth versus median U.S. household net worth is 7.8 times larger than the average middle American home. 7.8 times. Now, that's not the 230 times larger the Clintons boast. But it's embarrassing nonetheless for a career politician preaching socialism to the rest of us. And I'd like to pause there for a quick second. This is not somebody who went out and created wealth. This is not somebody who's ever really employed anybody except $12 an hour interns, or I guess you can afford those. This is not somebody who's created wealth. This is not somebody who's met payroll. This is not somebody, Bernie Sanders, who, to be completely honest, ever really had a real job. His whole socialist worldview has been nurtured, grown, developed in the quiet comfort of a mayor in Vermont, one of the most lefty states in the Union, has elected him to the Senate multiple times. His whole career has been set in the public sector, spending your money, not saving it, not protecting it. As a matter of fact, Bernie Sanders' proposal, his big proposal that has the left all a-Twitcher-pated, is an $18 trillion tax increase. According to the Wall Street Journal, $18 trillion. Now, if you've been paying attention, you know that we've managed to rack up a good part of this under the Obama administration, by the way. We as a country have racked up about $18 trillion in debt. Since George Washington, all the way through George Bush, we've racked up $18 trillion. Obama now has contributed a huge lion's share to that, and our Bernie Sanders, the socialist answer, wants to double that. Get us to $36 trillion in new spending, taxing, and entitlements. This is indeed back to the future. Okay, don't know why it took so long, but we finally reached the point, evidently, where people are sick of Hillary Clinton, and that includes a lot of Democrats. It takes a lot to turn a Democrat's stomach, and the fact that Hillary Clinton has so thoroughly affected that, I suppose that's a cause for celebration. But who's in the wings waiting? Well, you've got Bernie Sanders, creepy socialist, 30-plus year politician, same old thing, $18 trillion projected new debt under Bernie Sanders. And if for some reason Bernie stumbles, Bernie makes a lot of stumbles when you actually listen to what he says, who is really waiting in the wings? Like some kind of demented phantom of the opera lurking backstage? Well, that would be our own Elizabeth Warren. Yes, the calls are already out there to recruit Elizabeth Warren, to have her ride in on the back of her Palomino. Did Native Americans ride Palomino, Sparky? Because you all remember that Elizabeth Warren is famous primarily for faking her application to Harvard University, claiming under an affirmative action program that she was a Native American. Take a look at old Pocahontas there. You see a lot of Native American there? I see neon white. I see white out paper cleanup white there. Be that as it may, Elizabeth Warren's whole premise, like Bernie Sanders, is socialism. You work for us. Y'all remember this from 2012, don't you?
There is nobody in this country who got rich on his own. Nobody. You built a factory out there, good for you, but I want to be clear, you moved your goods to market on the roads the rest of us paid for. Yep. You hired workers, the rest of us paid to educate. You were safe in your factory because of police forces and fire forces that the rest of us paid for.
Now listen to that. You know, it really is shocking when you think about it. When I go back and think about the founding of this country was not founded by a strong, centralized government. In fact, if I read the founding documents correctly and understand history, it was exactly that kind of centralized government that the founders didn't want. Our country was built not by collectives. Our country was built by entrepreneurs from the ground up. It was built by individuals working hard. Those roads that she said belonged to all of us, they were built by us. They weren't built by the federal government. This idea somehow that there's this shocking disconnect between the federal government, who's responsible, and local government for that matter, who's responsible for all these good things, and the rest of us peons who just use those things to get ahead. There would be none of these things without the individual, without the entrepreneur, without the free market, without the ingenuity and industry of individual Americans. Those roads, those police forces, those are things that we built with our capital and gave back to the country. You need to remember that, Elizabeth Warren, as you move forward. But as a good little liberal Marxist socialist, the odds are you won't remember it. When you were back in Oklahoma City as a little girl playing Indian, evidently, in the middle of the city, these other things weren't reported very much. In your career now, we have some information about you. How about this? According to an Associated Press report from 2012, Elizabeth Warren was paid $429,981 as a Harvard law professor from 2010 to 2011. And on top of that, she received nearly $134,000 in consulting fees on legal cases during the same time period. This is right when she was giving her speech about "You didn't build this." This was right when a white, progressive, liberal woman used her abilities and her power to get a job otherwise reserved for minorities, to take a job away from a minority candidate, all in the name of claiming to be an Indian. You factor in investments, book deals, other income from Warren during that time period, she is a charter member of the 1% club she so says she despises. Her family net worth, her and her husband, is $15 million. And let's not forget, again, how this privileged neon white Warren secured that sinecure at Harvard. She applied for and received her position as an affirmative action hire claiming Native American heritage, as we just said, despite desperate efforts by the liberal press to authenticate this self-serving fiction. The best these junior genealogists could do is to suggest the possibility that Warren might indeed have 1/32nd Cherokee blood. That's 1/32nd Cherokee blood, which makes Hiawatha about as much an Indian as Ward Churchill. Even if we grant Pocahontas this 1/32nd Indian ancestry, oh, and by the way, for the record, the Cherokee Nation themselves do not acknowledge it, wouldn't it have been more progressive, more liberal, more socialist for her to stand aside and let a more genuine minority take such a high-paying, influential position? But not Pocahontas. No, white liberals invent and create racial and class conflicts out of whole cloth, not to help minority causes, but to enrich and legitimize their own power. That's the reality.
Do you have a question or comment you'd like Dr. Duke to respond to? Email the show at media@fpeusa.org.
And now it's time for the knockout round. A lot of people are saying a lot of bad things about Donald Trump. But if you go back and look at Trump all the way back to the 1980s, you will see that Trump has one thing he insists upon, that a wealthy America is an America that's better for us and for the world. The more wealth that more people share in this country, the more opportunities for wealth, the better off we're going to be able to be. The better off we're going to be able to provide defense for this country that will make the rest of the world respect us, the better off we're going to be able to deal with social issues. A rich America is a prosperous America, is a strong America. That Trump has been consistent with. If you look at those candidates on the left, particularly the alternatives to Hillary Clinton, people like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, we find it's exactly the opposite. Go back to the 80s and the 90s and listen to those people. They're talking about tax increases, socialism, they're talking about government interventionism, they're talking about, as Bernie Sanders actually said, we need a government that is willing to step in and regulate every aspect of American life that they think needs to be regulated. Well, we've seen how that's played out. They too, the Warrens of the world and the Bernie Sanders of the world, they have been consistent about a big government, high tax, high debt economy. That's what they'll give us. As a matter of fact, when we think about this, I'm taken back to those wonderful, glorious 1980s.
One of these things is not like the others. Which one is different? Do you know? Can you tell which thing is not like the others. I'll tell you if it is so.
Ah, Big Bird had better hair, actually, than Warren, Sanders, or Trump. Nonetheless, that 80s nostalgia there. One of these things is not like the other. One man is calling for a very wealthy America, and you got two socialists calling for continued stagnation. Now, I want you to know, this is not an endorsement of Trump. We don't endorse people here. It's just simply pointing out that if the media was doing its job, Trump would get credit for being consistent in his message, a message of prosperity. Whereas people like Warren and Sanders, they'd be knocked out on the basis of their own poor performance. And that's our knockout round.
Don't miss a second of Dr. Duke. Visit FreedomProject.com and sign up for our free newsletter. Like us on Facebook or follow us in the Twitterverse. All the links can be found at FreedomProject.com.